So it's time to start. So it's a pleasure for me and for the faculty to receive here today Professor Hari Srikanth from the University of South Florida. He received his PhD in experimental quantum matter physics from the Indian Institute of Science, and then after a long postdoc, he joined the University of South Florida in the year 2000, and he's an expert of many topics related to magnetism, and he's also a fellow of the American Physical Society and senior member of the IEEE. And this year he's one of the distinguished lecturers of the Society, which are people which are moving around the world giving the same talk, different aspects of the talk, and now we have the pleasure here to receive here Professor in Madrid in between different talks. This afternoon has only go to Zaragoza and then to Logroño, Bilbao, Gijón. It's like the Rolling Stones, but talking about physics instead of music. So before the talk, I'd like also to I think Professor Vázquez from the Society in Spain, he wants to give some word to us and encourage us to join the Society.
Okay, thank you. But anyway, it's my great pleasure to address just a few words, just 1 minute to say a few words about Professor Srikanth. And also, it's my pleasure to talk on behalf of the Magnetic Society. I think the Magnetic Society. This, as you know, Professor Srikanth is one of the distinguished lecturers of the IEEE Magnetic Society for this year, 2019. And this is one of the most attractive activities we are organizing in the Magnetic Society. So he has the possibility, or his duty is to give his talk all around the world. So up to now, he has given talk yesterday 45 talks.
No, 35.
30,
Close to that.
So just I wanted to profit of this opportunity to invite you to be members of the Magnetic Society. So this is very good opportunity to make publicity for the Magnetic Society. And please, just hear this excellent talk he's going to give us today. As no, this I'm really sure. So I would like to thank you also for coming visiting us here in Madrid. Well, this is thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manolo. Hola, buenos días, amigas y amigos. Mi nombre es Hari Srikanth y vengo de Florida. Muchas gracias por tu amable invitación. España es mi segundo hogar. Ama Madrid. That's the limit of my Spanish, folks, but I do come to Spain a lot, and it's great to see some friends, good old friends from many years back that I've known, Professor Manolo Vázquez, Professor Jacobo Santa Maria. Also great to meet some new people here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think as Manolo said, this is my job to go around the world and try to give these talks in the area of magnetism, and my topic is to try to convince you that anisotropic magnetic nanoparticles are the materials that you need for curing cancer. Or one of the ideas behind this is to have a therapy for cancer based on magnetic nanoparticles. So I think we should have these lights off. The screen will be better, if possible. And I'm here to tell you a story, and as you can see, it's the story of magnetic anisotropy. Great, yeah. So as you all know, I am originally from India, and we have these mantras, right? Om is one of them. The mantra for today is magnetic anisotropy. I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, some of you walking out of this room will be chanting anisotropy as you leave the room. So my goal is here to convince you, especially the role of magnetic anisotropy, which is very fundamental property of magnetic materials, as you know. It's important to be able to tune it and to be able to manipulate or engineer structures with different anisotropic properties. I would like to acknowledge all these agencies for funding our research over the years in magnetic materials in general, and especially I would like to say a few words about the IEEE Magnetic Society. And if you want to know more about the society, Mr. IEEE Magnetics is here. He is the ex-president of the society, and he'll be able to give you all the information, Professor Vasquez from Madrid. Okay, so please don't worry about reading all this material. Please go to the website here and you can get all the information. I would like to point out two aspects about this society which make it very exciting. One of them is this, of course, this distinguished lecturership that is offered to some of us. There are 4 of us, and in fact my partner in crime this year from Spain is Professor Victorino Franco, who's a good friend of mine from Sevilla. I don't know if he's already visited here, but he will talk about magnetic refrigeration if you get to invite him. So this is one of the things. Keep in mind that if you are a member of the IEEE Magnetic Society, whether you're senior or junior, you get discounted rates for 2 of the biggest conferences in magnetism. And we are talking about the MMM conference, which is held in the United States, and the Intermag, which is held around the world. There was one in Madrid a few years back. Okay, so that's one advantage. For the younger members of the audience, for the students, it turns out that if you are a member of this society, there is a very exciting program which is the Summer School in Magnetism that's held by the IEEE Magnetic Society every year. And this is held in different places around the world, in often exotic places. Unfortunately, not too exotic this year. It's going to be held in Richmond, Virginia, which is about 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. But to give you an idea, last summer, it was held in Quito, Ecuador. I would have loved to be there myself. So again, you have to be a member of the society, and those students that are selected for this summer school, they get financial support from the Magnetic Society. So it's a very interesting and exciting opportunity. So I would urge you to become members of the society. Let me also take this opportunity to welcome you to my university and the city of Tampa in Florida. If you remember Florida, it's a peninsula with water on all sides and 3 sides, and we are on the west coast, in the coast of Gulf of Mexico in Florida. And the beaches are really much better than the other coasts. Believe me, this is not because it's my city. Every year, probably in April, there's a ranking that comes out ranking the beaches, and Clearwater Beach, which is actually part of Tampa Bay, is always ranked #1 in the past several years, and it's part of Tampa Bay, all right? Something about my department, we are a pretty large university, not as big as Complutense. You are huge, you're a monster in terms of size, but we are up there. We are about half your size. We have about 48,000 students total. We are one of the biggest in the country as a public university, and about 35,000 are in Tampa, okay, which is the main campus. In the physics department where I come from, we offer a PhD in applied physics, and this is unique to the state of Florida. You have other universities, Gainesville, you have Florida State University, Tallahassee, where the National Magnet Lab is, but they don't offer a PhD in applied physics. We are the only ones that are doing it. So if you want to live or stay close to the best beach in the world, okay, best beach in the United States, and get a PhD in applied physics, we are the only choice. So please pass the word around. We would love to have some Spanish-speaking students. You will feel at home. Believe me, it's Florida. Everybody speaks Spanish, except me, maybe. All right, so I would also like to acknowledge members of my group over the years that have done excellent work, that has made this possible for me to go around and give talks. And these are the ones in green are the ones that contributed to this work that I'm going to present today. And one of them you recognize is from España. It's from Javier Alonso. He's now an assistant professor in Santander. Okay, so he spent 3 years with me, and in fact, we had a pretty interesting time. He was one of the main people that drove this research in my lab, in my group when he was here. We work on a variety of materials, but today's topic is going to be on magnetic nanoparticles, specifically for nanomedicine. That's the main topic here. In the lab, as in any magnetic measurements or magnetic materials lab, we have a variety of techniques. We make nanoparticles, we synthesize them, we also make the thin films, and we have a variety of tools for characterizing the magnetic properties. One of the culture in my lab is we have a physical property measurement system, PPMS. We have 2 of them, which is a superconducting magnet, and we can vary the temperature from pumped helium to room temperature. We use these as platforms for giving us the field and temperature range, and most students, they build their own user experiments that fit into the PPMS. So we have our own inserts, and I will talk about 2 of them today which are relevant to today's topic, namely anisotropy and anisotropic nanoparticles. One of them is rather unique to us. It's a signature experiment we do. We've been doing this for many years. We do what is called radio frequency transverse susceptibility. It's a very precise and sensitive technique to look at the effective anisotropy in magnetic materials as well as switching. We can look at the magnetization dynamics with a high degree of precision. So I will talk about that. And the second experiment I will talk about is actually measuring hyperthermia, potential of magnetic nanoparticles, which is trying to see how much heat we can generate with these magnetic particles with the goal of killing cancer cells. All right, so these are the 2 experiments that we need to go over. Okay, so the outline is as follows. This is an outreach talk, so I'm going to assume that not everybody here is familiar with magnetism, so it's going to be a broad outreach talk. So please allow me to give some introduction about some of the main areas. And of course, it's all about the mantra for today, which is magnetic anisotropy. So I'll explain in very simple terms what it is and how we can control this. And the main part of the talk is going to be anisotropic nanoparticles for biomedical applications. I don't think I will have time to get to this. However, at the end of the talk, if you ask me a leading question, I can show you 40 more slides. No, I don't have time for that. All right, so what is magnetic anisotropy? And what's the basic idea behind anisotropy? Well, as you know, those working in magnetism know this very well, that magnetic anisotropy is perhaps the most important physical parameter that you would like to control the magnetic properties. And by magnetic properties in ferromagnets, we are talking about the magnetization curves, or the hysteresis loops, as it's called. And that is critical for this application, nanomedicine. All right? So if you want to think of magnetic anisotropy, well, magnetism is rooted in quantum mechanics, so we can't go all the way back and start understanding what electronic spins are. So let's start with taking the magnetization vector, okay? If you have a magnetic material, think of the magnetization vector, which is like an arrow. When you apply an external field, you are basically, there's an energy by this field, and essentially your moment, or the magnetization vector, is going to align or saturate in the direction of the applied field at high fields. And at low fields, of course, there is an internal energy because of the fact there is a magnet, because of various possibilities, especially anisotropy. The magnetization vector would like to align in a preferred direction. This is what anisotropy is all about. I am a physicist like many of you, so I have to show at least one equation in my slide. So this is my equation slide. It's a very basic equation. All it tells you is that at high fields, this term, the Zeeman energy dominates, and so you have saturation. You're forcing the magnetization to align in the direction of the field. And at low fields, the internal energy, which is captured by this so-called anisotropy, is going to determine which direction your magnetization vector is pointing. That's all there is to it. So it's a competition between these 2 energies that determines the shape of the hysteresis loop. Okay? So which means you can explain why some magnetic materials are easy to magnetize and some are hard to magnetize. The shape of the hysteresis is because of this competing energy scales, and that's what we are going to use to try to characterize as well as tune anisotropy. Well, you can handle other types of symmetries. I use the uniaxial here because it has no preferred direction, typical for nanoparticles, but in principle you can have preferred directions, and we can handle that. But when it comes to nanoparticles, you have to think about other terms, many terms that contribute to this internal energy or the effective anisotropy. For example, you have to think about surfaces. Those of you working on nanoparticles, you're all surface scientists. Because as you know, all the physical properties, including magnetism, is controlled by the surface atoms. So you should be able to manipulate the surface of nanoparticles and thus directly change the shape of the hysteresis loop, which is one of our goals. Okay? And the next is shape anisotropy, and this is very easy to understand. You can make nanowires or nanorods. I talked to Lucas, and saw some of the work that they're doing on nanowires. You can actually, in this case, you have a preferred direction, and the magnetization prefers to lie in along the longitudinal axis. So you can change the shape of the particles and make sure that you are controlling the anisotropy, and that helps you for certain applications. Strain can play a role. If you take a hybrid material with the interface between two different materials, you can use the substrate or the strain in one material to control the magnetism in the other. This is well known, so you can use that also to tune the effective anisotropy. Configuration, I will give you some example of what configuration can play a role. You can have clusters, nanoparticle clusters that you can make or synthesize, which have different configurations or shapes, and use that as a way to change anisotropy. And last but not the least, exchange coupling, again resulting from interfaces. If you take an antiferromagnet and a ferromagnet, and because of the interface, the difference in the anisotropy, you can actually change the shape of the hysteresis loop as well as even move it around. This is the exchange bias. And exchange bias is well known to the spintronics community. It's the reason why we have MRAMs, for example. Turns out that exchange coupling, I will show later on, is equally important for the nanomedicine community. Okay? So we will see that exchange coupled nanoparticles are indeed very effective for hypothermia. So these are the types of anisotropies one is dealing with. Okay, so anisotropy is omnipresent, ubiquitous. That's what hopefully it says in Spanish. It turns out that making anisotropic nanoparticles or nanostructures is actually easier than making perfectly isotropic ones. And it's there everywhere. So just to give you an idea, I'm going to show you 3 TEM images. And what is the same particles here? What you're seeing here, these are all magnetite or iron oxide ferrite nanoparticles of a similar class of materials. And the interesting thing is to see the origin, the source of these images, these TEM images. And that's what makes it interesting. And if you notice, all these particles have some kind of anisotropy built in. The first one is a chain of magnetite nanoparticles. Can someone guess what this might be? Do I hear bacteria? That's the answer. So it turns out that these are magnetotactic bacteria. There are some bacteria that produce magnetite or iron oxide nanocrystals, and using dipolar coupling they can make these short chains. And they are making these short chains exactly for the same reason that the Chinese, when they discovered lodestone, they found that they can make compasses out of the magnets. So these guys, these bacteria, are making tiny compasses with nanoparticle chains for the same reason. They want to navigate towards a source of food. Okay? By the way, before coming to Spain, I was in Greece, and there was a little bit of the audience was upset when I said Chinese discovered magnetism, because of course it has to be ancient Greeks. And I looked up the literature. It turns out that Pallas of Miletus is credited to have done the first experiments on electricity and magnetism, but the Chinese were the ones that made the compass. Okay, that is clear. So these bacteria followed the Chinese and made these compasses, as I said. The second example is out of this world, truly, literally so. It turns out that these are the same kind of iron oxide or magnetite nanocrystals, and look at how anisotropic they are. They're faceted nanocrystals, and these were found in a chunk of meteorite from Mars that crashed into the Arizona desert. All right? And a little bit of history for you, those of you working in nanomagnetism. In the 1930s, when people started looking at single domain nanoparticles and also coined the term superparamagnetism, it was not done by physicists, not by chemists, not by engineers, it was done by geologists. So the first studies of nanomagnetism was possible because of geologists who started looking at paleomagnetism, magnetism in rocks. Okay? Just wanted to give you an idea how it all started. The third example, again you can see the similarity. These are the same kind of ferrites, faceted ferrites. This is produced in the lab of a good friend and a collaborator of mine, Mike McHenry at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. So he uses a microwave plasma technique in a chamber to make these anisotropic nanoparticles. So what I wanted to show here is that anisotropic nanoparticles are everywhere. They are found naturally. You can make them easily. So let's try to use them, utilize them for some applications. Okay? All right, so just to give you an idea, the main types of, when I say tuning the anisotropy, I mean changing the shape. This, we can call this shape anisotropy, or changing the surface in some interesting patterns. We can do this with solution chemistry. I'll show you nanoparticles later on. We can actually, we actually have a very good way of controlling the particle shapes and sizes, anywhere between the 5 to 50 nanometer range using chemical methods. In fact, we can pretty much produce any kind of Archimedean shapes now in nano size. Okay? So that's what we mean by shape anisotropy. Hopefully I've convinced you that anisotropy is important. Now, in the next few minutes, I'm going to introduce a technique that we developed, which is a very powerful technique for actually measuring anisotropy very precisely and effectively. Of course, magnetic anisotropy can be studied in many different techniques. Ferromagnetic resonance, for example, or BLS, Brillouin light scattering, are two examples. But what I'm going to introduce now is a very effective method that we use using a resonant method. It's a resonant radio frequency technique, and we measure what is called the transverse susceptibility using this method. This is a tunnel diode oscillator. So here's a schematic of how we do this experiment. If you look at the schematic, you can see that it's an oscillator. It's a tank circuit. It's an LC resonator that is driven by a tunnel diode. Students in the audience, if you remember your AC circuits and remember the tunnel diode characteristics, you have a negative resistance region. There's a region where you apply a bias voltage, you have a current that goes negative and then comes out, right? If you bias the tunnel diode in this negative resistance region, it acts as a power supply to the LC tank, and essentially you can make self-sustained, self-resonant oscillators, very stable ones, ultra-stable oscillators. So that's what we make. You put the sample inside there, and the transverse geometry is because of the perpendicular fields, the DC field which is generated by a superconducting magnet, the PPMS, for example. We put the whole system in there like this. And then the transverse geometry is because the DC field is perpendicular to the small modulating RF field, high frequency field, setting up a transverse geometry. The transverse configuration is not very strange because that's what is used in FMR. Ferromagnetic resonance, for example, you have these crossed fields, and also NMR, you have crossed fields. Okay? And what we do is we just put in a frequency counter and then measure the shift in the frequency, and from that we extract the change in the so-called transverse susceptibility. In the next minute, I'll explain to you why we do it in this transverse configuration. Okay? The sensitivity is very high because it's a frequency measurement, and students, experimentalists in the audience should know that frequency is perhaps the most accurately measurable physical quantity. Ideally, you want to measure any physical quantity using a frequency probe. Okay? So that's what we do here. It gives us a good sensitivity. And the other thing is that with a frequency counter, we can detect shifts in the resonance frequency of the circuit of the order of a few hertz in an overall resonance of 25 megahertz. You do the math, you can get parts per million resolution when looking at very fine magnetic phase transitions. So we've used this technique for many, many years for looking at all kinds of magnetic materials, certainly in nanoparticles. So this is a very effective way for measuring the important quantities, namely the switching fields and the anisotropy fields in magnetic materials. So why transverse? We were motivated by a very old paper by a theorist, Amika Maharoni from Israel. He published this in 1957. It's an analytical calculation of both components of the susceptibility, the parallel longitudinal component and the transverse component. This was in the Bulletin of Israeli Physical Society. It was hard to get, but here it is. This is the original scan of the graph. Okay? So what he did was he took a single domain particle, Stoner-Wolfach, t equal to 0 calculation, study, and he just plotted the conventional susceptibility, which is nothing but taking the derivative of your magnetization curve, and the transverse susceptibility, which is a tensor. It is the projection of the magnetization in the perpendicular direction. In other words, you're measuring some kind of a stiffness of the magnetization. Okay? So this is reduced field, and you go from positive to negative polarity, and you can see that the conventional parallel susceptibility, as you would expect, has a singularity when you have the switching. Okay? Think of it as taking the first derivative of your hysteresis loop. So wherever the largest slope changes, you see a peak. And he pointed out that if you look at the transverse susceptibility, in addition to the switching peak, you also have two peaks that are symmetric, and they happen to be at the anisotropy field for this system. And the physics of this is reasonably clear, because as I mentioned the equation, it's a competition between the Zeeman energy at high fields and the internal magnetic anisotropy. So you have a crossover, and that's what gives rise to these peaks. So if we can set up a geometry to measure the transverse susceptibility, which is exactly what we did in our experiment, we can measure peaks, and yeah, we've been seeing these peaks for more than 15 years now on many, many different systems, and we can characterize them, we can extract the anisotropy constants and everything, okay? Very reliable. So for example, here's a lanthanum calcium manganate film, well-defined directions, so the peaks are sharp. We can read off the HK values, the anisotropy peaks, and then we can extract the anisotropy energy, okay? For nanoparticles, for example, these are 10 nanometer maghemite particles, gamma Fe2O3. This is to show you that we can do this experiment very quickly in a PPMS. We can change the temperature and the DC field, and we can get some kind of a phase diagram, if you may, in the HT plane of how the magnetization dynamics changes, okay? For example, you can see that you see the super paramagnetic behavior, that's 1/T dependence, blocking here, and then you can actually see the peaks here. So we can characterize everything using this experiment. It's a very powerful technique to probe the effective anisotropy, all right? So at this point, I've hopefully convinced you that anisotropy is important. We have to tune this. We can also measure it very accurately. And now let us turn our attention to nanomedicine and how we can use these nanoparticles, anisotropic nanoparticles, for biomedical applications. I'm going to change time reversal symmetry and go closer to these young ladies here for the rest of the talk. All right, so let's talk about typically where these magnetic nanoparticles are used in biomedical applications. Let's start with this one right here. Nanoparticles, magnetic nanoparticles, can be effective carriers for navigating drugs to a local area where it needs to be delivered. This is called site-specific or targeted drug delivery. And this is an area, we don't work in this, but there are other groups that are trying to optimize the characteristics where you can have site-specific drug delivery. In this case, the magnetic particles are just ships carrying, they're functionalized, the surface is functionalized, you can attach various drug molecules, and you can actually deliver it non-invasively with an external field, and that's the advantage of magnetism, right? And to a local area and deliver the drugs, okay? So that's the idea behind site-specific drug delivery compared to the way we take drugs now normally is we take a pill, we swallow it, or we take a shot. And in this case, the drugs are coursing through your entire circulatory system. So it's a systemic drug delivery, and obviously there'll be side effects. So the whole idea is to minimize the side effects, to treat only the area while locally delivering the drugs, and magnetic particles can be used as navigational aids, okay? Here's another area, and we have some work in this area too in my group. We can actually use magnetic nanoparticles for enhancing the quality of MRI images. MRI, as you know, is a well-established technique available in most hospitals for brain scans, tissue scans. It works on the principle of NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. The idea here is to excite the water protons and make them precess by a high frequency radiation, and then you remove this field, so there is a dephasing or a relaxation. There are several relaxation times here, T1, T2. We won't go into deeper into this, but from the relaxation time, T2, you can make images like this. So that's the conventional MRI. Now what happens if we take nanoparticles, magnetic particles, and introduce it locally to the area? Due to the fringing fields of these nanoparticles, the fringing fields interfere with the relaxation time. In fact, it slows down the T1 and T2. And from this difference, you can get an enhanced contrast of the MRI images. This has been validated. It's a very well-established technique now that magnetic nanoparticles can indeed improve the MRI images, okay? So that's a very important breakthrough in nanomedicine. I'm going to skip this. We can also use it for cell separation, but the focus is going to be on can we use these magnetic nanoparticles by themselves? Can we use it by themselves to kill the cancer cells? And the way we can do it is what is called magnetic hyperthermia, or generating heat locally to kill the cancer cells. There is no other drug molecules needed or drug needed. Using the magnetic particles themselves to generate locally, heat up the tumor area and kill the cancer cells. So this is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my talk, and show how things can be optimized and where we are in this particular field. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We are going to heat up, and it turns out that all you need to do is heat up the local temperature just by a few degrees Celsius. The therapeutic window is 40 to 45 degrees Celsius, so it's just a few degrees Celsius above the body temperature, and cancer cells, and sustain this heating for some time, 30 to 50 minutes, and the cancer cells, 30 minutes to an hour, and you kill the cancer cells. Cancer cells do not like heat. They do not like Florida in summer. Okay, so basically that's how we are going to do. We are going to try to generate heat by switching to an AC field, with a large field amplitude, so that we can actually generate a fair amount of power dissipation. That's the idea behind this technique. So it's AC magnetic hyperthermia. I am not a biochemist, but it turns out that when you have sustained heating of the cancer cells, this is what happens. You have protein denaturation, you have the cell membrane changing, and essentially the idea is to break the cell membrane one way or the other, to destroy the cell membrane so that the cancer cannot grow. That's what happens, and eventually the cell is going towards deactivation or death. We call this process apoptosis. If you want to think about apoptosis, it's a very friendly and benign way of killing cancer, as opposed to the opposite, which is necrosis. Necrosis is a brute force, aggressive way of killing cancer. Do we have examples of necrosis? Sure we do. That's chemotherapy, radiation therapy for you, that's commonly used. It's a very effective way of killing cancer. However, a lot of collateral damage. The immune system breaks down. You can see, those of you that have cancer patients in your families or among your friends, you know visibly what the patient goes through with all kinds of side effects. So the goal here is to use magnetic hyperthermia, which is relatively benign, as a supplemental therapy in addition to chemo, of course, so that you can actually reduce the dosage of chemo. So people ask me all this time, is hyperthermia going to replace chemotherapy? No, the answer is no. Chemo is still the most effective way of treating cancer. However, we believe that hyperthermia, magnetic hyperthermia, which I'm talking about, is going to be an excellent supplemental technique that will add on, and in fact it can reduce the chemo dosage, it can increase the time between chemo dosage, it can improve the quality of the patient quite a bit. So that's the hope. All right, so I'll give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is this technique works, it has been demonstrated. The bad news is 3 letters, FDA. In the United States, we have what is called the Food and Drug Administration. For good reasons, they generally take a lot of time before we transition any kind of new medical technology to clinical trials, mainly trials actually trying it on human patients. So we don't have approval yet for human trials. The good news is you guys in Europe are way ahead of the curve. It turns out that this company, as far as I know, this is the only company, there may be other companies doing this. MagForce, this is the only well-known company, which is based in Berlin, Germany. They got approval from the European Union many years back and got millions of euros, and they actually are doing human trials, clinical trials with human patients, and they are producing great results, very promising, okay? And we are hoping that this would convince the FDA and eventually, in most of the countries, to start embracing this new technology of cancer therapy. Okay, so I will now talk about a little bit of physics of how this heating happens, right? How do we heat the particles? By applying AC magnetic fields through hysteresis loops. This is the reason I spent some time telling you about how to change the shapes of the magnetization, the hysteresis loops, because that's exactly what we need to do. We have to generate hysteresis, a large amount of hysteresis and loops like this. This is the AC hysteresis loop. Please do not confuse this with the DC magnetization that you measure in a squid. Remember, these are small particles, superparamagnetic particles. There is no coercivity, there is no hysteresis. However, this hysteresis here is because at high frequencies, when you take these nanoparticles, apply high frequency fields, think of them as superspins. Each particle is a ferromagnet by itself with a large magnetization. They try to follow the high frequency, they cannot, and they go out of phase, and that causes up the opening of this kind of hysteresis loop. Okay? So we're talking about the AC hysteresis loop. And of course, you know from basic physics that the area inside the hysteresis is nothing but dissipation, and the dissipation here is in the form of heat. This is exactly the principle how we generate heat by applying AC, by maximizing or optimizing this AC hysteresis loop. Now you can see that we can do several things, of course. We can actually change the frequency and the external field using power sources. We can also optimize the materials so that you have larger saturation magnetization and bigger area. Naively, you can also think that, okay, if I can change the shape of the loops through anisotropy, that will have an effect on this hysteresis. So I'm going to show you, indeed it has, and it has a very big effect on increasing the dissipation, which is what we want. Okay? Like any other technique, we have a figure of merit, and the figure of merit for this community is called SAR, and it's nothing but the area multiplied by the frequency of the radiation. It is also called SLT, specific loss power. It's one and the same quantity, it's the power dissipated, which is heat. Okay, keep in mind that we need to optimize the nanoparticles. We need to produce high quality nanoparticles with large saturation magnetization because we don't want to put too many particles. Remember, this is for treatment with humans. So we don't want to inject foreign particles into a large amount into the human body. So we want to optimize the material to give you the best response of the large SAR. And we are going to now look at some strategies of how to do that. I'm sorry, I promised only one equation slide. Please bear with me. This is just to show you that you can actually calculate the power dissipated in these conditions of AC hyperthermia. You can see that it's related to the product of the amplitude and frequency, and also there are some time scales. You know, we are talking about the moments trying to follow the high frequency, so there are some time scales. There are two important time scales here. One is called tau b, which is the Brownian relaxation time, and the other one is tau n, which is the Néel relaxation time. Remember that if the environment allows it, particles can rotate. They can physically move, and this can result in the Brownian-like motion, and you have a relaxation time associated with that. And of course, the Néel relaxation is with the coherent rotation of the magnetic moments of these single domain particles or small particles. Okay? So it's a combination that gives rise to the effective time, which goes into this equation here. So to increase the power dissipation, one simple strategy is to come up with materials with large magnetization. That's one way to increase the SAR. There is some size dependence, and it's very critical because it turns out that the small particles, too small, if it's too small, if it's too big, they're not going to work. There is a sweet spot in this community. We know that the particle size has to be close to the single domain to multi-domain transition. Okay? It should not be really super paramagnetic. I'll tell you, explain to you why. Well, for health reasons, it should not be smaller than 10 nanometers, period. And the reason is because if you make very small particles, 5 nanometers or something like that, you have the possibility of these particles penetrating the blood-brain barrier and ending up in the brain, the wrong place where you want these particles to go. Ideally, you want these particles to treat the tumor, kill the tumor, and go down south to Florida, basically get flushed out of your system. So we don't want particles, too small particles, because chances of them going to the brain is very high. Okay? All right, so now let's look at the possible ways of looking at this, But before that, let me also show you how we measure the heating caused by these nanoparticles. We do it in 2 different ways. We have a very close collaboration with a group in Spain, in Bilbao, at the University of Basque Country. Have been working together for many years in this area. Professor Manu Barandiaran, Malu Gubieda, you know all these people. They work in this area. So in our lab, we use what is called a calorimetric method to determine the heat generated. So that's our power supply. It's an AC power supply. It's at a fixed frequency of 325 kilohertz, and we can change the AC field amplitude. Remember that the field amplitudes are much higher, very high, not like the ones you have in your squid. In your squid, the field amplitudes are very small, 10 Oersted. Here we're talking about a few hundred Oersted, up to a kilo Oersted. Okay? So we can generate that. Particles are sitting there. We can actually put a temperature sensor and directly measure the heat. And what we plot here is the change in temperature or the increase in temperature as a function of time. So it's a SAR equation. So in our case, the data looks like this. This is for manganese ferrite. So we take, in this case, it's manganese ferrite nanoparticles. So you can see under different conditions of applied AC field at this fixed frequency of 325 kilohertz, we have these curves. And the therapeutic window is 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. So we can optimize this so that we can have a large slope, heat it fast, and then hold the temperature in that window. There is no reason to overheat it. There is no reason, of course, at low fields, you won't get to that. So you need to come up with this simple condition of optimization where you can come to this 40 to 45 degrees Celsius and hold it for about 40 minutes for the treatment, okay? So by looking at this, you can say that for these particles, under these conditions, about 500 Oersted field at the frequency of 325 kilohertz, in our case it's a fixed frequency power supply, is the ideal condition for hypothermia. So this is how we determine the SAR, okay? What is the right SAR for this? Okay, so we make these nanoparticles and ship it to Bilbao. And our group, our collaborators in Bilbao, these are some people that are working there, Irati, and all Basque names, as you can imagine. And basically what they've done is they have built a very large power supply using big capacitor banks. So they measure the hysteresis loop at high frequency, okay? As you know, you can measure the hysteresis loop and get the area, and from that you can get the SAR. So that's what they do. They actually measure the SAR using this equation here. So their data looks like this. They are measuring the hysteresis loops. You don't need to achieve saturation. You can get it from the minor loops, okay? And what we do is that we make a comparison of the SAR, and this is why we have our Basque postdoctoral fellow with us who was doing all this exchange, Javi Alonso. And so basically, we compare the SARs and we make sure that there is a reliable match between the SAR values you get before we take it to the biomedical stage, biological stage. A little tip for the students in the audience especially. These days, if you want to publish a paper in a high impact journal, and I'm sure in Complutense you all want to all the time, you have to, typically, if you want to prove a result, you need to have two different experiments that agree and converge to the same result. It's more convincing, okay? Well, here we have two different experiments in two different labs in two different countries. So the idea is that, of course, collaborations, international collaborations are very important for solving many of the problems in nanoscience as well as material science. Okay, I keep saying that we can apply kilohertz and we can apply Oersted fields. Why this limitation? Why can't we apply megahertz, gigahertz, Tesla, 2 Tesla fields? Unfortunately, we cannot do that. This is a treatment for humans, so we have to make sure that we have to work within certain conditions, certain threshold, and this is captured by something which is known in the literature. It's not written in stone, of course. It's a guide, it's a suggestion that the product of the AC amplitude, magnitude, field magnitude, and the frequency should be that in these units. Think of this as the pain threshold. Remember, this is the treatment given to humans for an extended period of time, okay, under these conditions. So the person is going to feel some effect of that. These are high power, high field, high frequency, okay? And so the pain threshold, if you want the best way to think of pain threshold, take a patient going to an emergency room in the hospital in the United States, and it's probably the same in Spain. The first person that meets the patient, who we call a triage nurse, he or she, the first question they ask is, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your pain level? And you say 2 or 3, or if you're close to dying, you say 8 or 9. That's what we mean by this pain threshold. So this is a suggested, number to keep in mind, and that's why we have to work with a few hundred kilohertz in frequency and a few hundred Oersted in field. We cannot exceed this keeping in mind that eventually these conditions have to be applied to human patients. Okay? All right. Now we can look at different candidates for the materials, because we know how to change the frequency, and we have power supplies and all those things. Those we can change, but now the only thing remaining is to do some material science and optimize the conditions for increasing the SAR. Here there is a serious limitation, and this is again those three letters that I mentioned, FDA. The only FDA approved material, magnetic material for this is iron oxide, magnetite, magnemite, iron oxide. We don't have too much of a choice. We can't use Heusler alloys or any other type of exotic materials, magnetic materials, and show that we can make hypothermia out of these. So if you're making exotic materials, I've seen some papers in the literature reporting SAR on some exotic material, but it's DOA, dead on arrival. It's not going to go anywhere. So please don't measure hypothermia on just every magnetic material you can find. It's very specific. It has to be biocompatible. Otherwise, even with iron oxide, we're having trouble convincing the FDA to go to the next stage. So keep that in mind. So ideally, biocompatibility is a very important criterion. And here, only the iron oxide is approved for this biocompatibility. But if you look at the SAR value, iron oxide is low compared to iron cobalt. So obviously there's a problem here. We'll see how we can tackle this. There's some size dependence, but anisotropy is an open question. Remember that you can change the anisotropy and change the shape of the hysteresis loops, which will have an effect on the area in the loop and dissipation. So nobody really took the effort to systematically study this. Again, that's the reason I'm giving my talk here. We were one of the first groups that started looking at correlation between anisotropy in nanoparticles directly with the SAR. Okay? But we took a look at this. Can we fool the cells? All we need is a biocompatible surface, right? So can we make a core shell particle with iron, which has a larger magnetization, saturation, and completely encapsulated by iron oxide using a core shell approach? So that's what we wanted to try first. I'm going to show you some results. Okay? So in this case, keep in mind that we want to make core shell nanoparticles. If you look at the bulk saturation magnetization, iron oxide is 90, iron is much bigger. So if you can make a core shell but keep the surface biocompatible by having magnetite and iron inside, the chances of getting a larger effective saturation magnetization and higher SAR is possible. So here are some core shell nanoparticles made in my group. We have a very good wet chemistry lab in my group, and I am a physicist. I'm not a chemist, but I hired some really nice postdocs, clever postdocs who had a chemistry background, who started this work, and it got passed on generations, and we can make really high quality particles. And that is needed for improving the SAR. Okay? All right, so if those of you that are interested in chemical synthesis, we use a very standard technique. This is thermal decomposition. It's nothing fancy. It's probably done in Madrid and other places here. So essentially, the idea here is to control the particles and make monodispersed particles, high quality particles, single crystalline particles. And the way you control that is by changing the reaction time, the temperature, and also the surfactants that you use during the growth process. You can, for example, change the surfactants and arrest the growth in different directions, and we can actually change the shapes of the particles using this technique. Okay? That's how we make these nanoparticles. So we started making this core shell, iron oxide shell, core shell particle. It turns out there's a problem. And this problem is called the Kendall effect. It is known to the metallurgy community many years back. By the way, metallurgy is almost non-existent now. When I was a student, I'm sure Professor Vasquez, for example, remembers there used to be departments of metallurgy. Now they're all Department of Material Science. You hardly find departments of metallurgy. Anyway, so this Kendall effect is a problem because you start off with iron core, iron oxide shell. Because of the differential diffusion of the metal ion in comparison with the oxygen ion, there is an instability at the interface, and because of that you have these voids opening up, holes. They become bigger and bigger. The iron in the core oxidizes and the shell becomes thicker. It becomes a hollow nanoparticle. So if you want to make hollow nanoparticles, start with the metal oxide core shell. Okay, that's what we found out. It's not just us, there are other groups that actually use this method for making hollow nanoparticles. Paul Alivisatos in Berkeley and his group has been doing this for a while. So, but this is a problem. If you want to make hollow nanoparticles, it's a great technique. But for SAR, unfortunately, it's not the right system because you don't want something properties changing over time. It's not reliable. That's what we found out. In the process, we did a lot of work understanding how the magnetization dynamics change as you go from systematically from some core shell to core wide shell to hollow nanoparticles. But unfortunately, if we started looking at the SAR, look at this one first. I am going to show you SAR as histograms for comparison. Okay? So yes, the proof of concept worked. We thought that the SAR should go up, it did, as it should, right? So comparatively, if you take the solid nanoparticles and the core shell particles at a higher SAR as soon as you synthesize it. Our happiness, unfortunately, was short-lived, precisely a few days to a few weeks at most. And here is a chart here that shows the SAR, and you can see that as a function of time, the SAR value drops, and eventually when the particles become hollow, they are useless. And we don't have a good measure of this time scale. Unfortunately, it's not in our hands. It depends on various conditions, including humidity. It could be different in Florida or other places, right? So this is not a system that is reliable, so we had to toss it and move on to something else to improve the SAR. But the idea of core shell is very important, and it stuck with us that we need to stick with core shell, but we cannot have a metal inside. We need to have all oxide core shell structures. In that case, there is no problem with the differential diffusion if it's an all oxide system, so that's what we wanted to move to. And while we were thinking about this, there is this fantastic group in Korea that scooped us a few years back. They made cobalt ferrite, manganese ferrite core shell particles. This is all oxide, there is no Kendall effect, they're very stable. And they actually had a large exchange bias. So these are nano spin valves. Each one of them is a spin valve by itself. It's showing exchange bias. And they reported exchange bias. They also reported a very large SAR value. So basically, this is an extremely good way of having exchange coupled systems which can give you a large SAR value. This is what I meant by what is good for spintronics is also good for nanomedicine here. Okay? All right, so okay, you looked at it, cobalt. The minute you see cobalt, the medical community will basically say no. Cobalt is poison, okay? So, but keep in mind that Fe3O4, the basic material which is biocompatible, which is approved by FDA, even with that we are having problem convincing them about this technique. So this is not going to work. It's not going to be quickly approved by the FDA. So we wanted to go back to the basics and use the same idea and make biocompatible core shell exchange coupled nanoparticles. So one of the postdocs in my group, Hafsa Khurshid, she took up this challenge and she made these particles, FeO, Fe3O4. We had the shell as Fe3O4, so it's completely biocompatible, it's well known, and FeO inside. FeO is a lesser known iron oxide phase, it is the Wüstite phase. And guess what? It's antiferromagnetic. By the way, there is a group in Spain that is studying these structures also in Barcelona. Professor Josep Nogués and his group has been looking at this too. Okay? This is also a spin valve. Here's our measurement showing you exchange bias. We can actually shift the loop and all that you expect. But in this case, we are convinced that this is the right system because we have magnetite completely encapsulating the FeO. We don't have Kendall effect. It's a stable system, so we thought this is the right thing. Okay. I have to tell you that in my lab, we have a little competition among the members, students and postdocs. Whoever makes the highest quality nanoparticles, something exotic, we give them a title of Wizard of the Year. Wizard as in Harry Potter, okay? And of course, if it's a lady, it's Hermione. So turns out that the Hermione that year was Hafsa Khurshid because what she decided was she went further. She made these core shell particles, FeO, Fe3O4, and then on top of that, she also changed the shapes systematically to look at anisotropy effect. Remember, that was her original idea, to change the anisotropy. So she went ahead and made these exchange coupled particles using similar techniques. And again, the main way we can change these shapes is by clever usage of surfactants, okay, to inhibit growth in certain directions, to allow growth in the others faster. So that's how we do this. So she made the same system. She made something nearly spherical, cubic, and also this exotic star-shaped octopods. Again, systematically varying the surface anisotropy, and we wanted to compare the SAR values. Okay, so the next slide I'm showing you is probably the most important slide of this presentation, because it's a direct comparison of the effect of anisotropy on the SARs. So it's called dancing with the SARs, okay? So basically you go from spheres to cubes to octopods, and just look at this, there is a clear effect. If you increase the anisotropy, the shape or surface anisotropy or a combination, you get higher SARs for the same system. And I think we were one of the first groups that promoted this, proposed this. Initially there was not very, it was not embraced well, but now most of the groups understand the effect of anisotropy. That you cannot simply stick with spherical particles, you need to change the aspect ratio. You need to make nanowires, nanorods, and exotic, surface, change the surface anisotropy. So again, very clear that anisotropy has a big influence on this thing, okay? So we got excited, we know that this is going to work, and we need to go to even more anisotropic nanoparticles. Remember the bacteria with the short chains? So we thought, okay, let's take a look at the bacteria. When I say we, I mean the collective we, because I'm including our collaborators from Bilbao, and they jumped on it and they did it. So here's the result from Basque Country, from reported in these papers many years back. So they actually looked at the SAR of the bacteria with the chains, and they actually found very impressive SARs. So the clues are pointing towards high aspect ratio anisotropic nanoparticles as being the most effective for optimizing the heating efficiency for hypothermia. Since Malu and a group they already did this bacteria, we wanted to do something else, so we thought, why not make nanorods? Iron oxide, magnetite nanorods that sort of mimic the same kind of chains made by these bacteria. So we made these nanorods using a different technique. It's a hydrothermal technique. Hydrothermal technique is an excellent way for making high aspect ratio nanorods, certainly of iron oxides and many other systems. In this case, in addition to the time, temperature, surfactants, you throw in pressure as an additional variable to control the shape. So that's how it works. It's a pressure cooker. You cook the particles, okay? And so we can make very high quality magnetite nanorods. And I'm going to say, without basically tell you that this is one of the highest quality nanorods of magnetite you will ever see. And I have reasons to prove that. I'll show you. One important thing about particles is that if you want to get the best SAR, you need to make the best particles. The particle quality has to be very high, which means you need to have very high single crystalline nature and also try to achieve the highest saturation magnetization possible in comparison to the bulk, okay? We did that, and we were able to achieve this in these nanorods. We did some studies on aspect ratio and found the best thing and all that. So, but let me show you the results. We had SAR values. Some of these SAR values are very, very impressive. One of the highest SARs reported in iron oxide, magnetite, the basic material, biocompatible iron oxide. So we can go way beyond spherical particles and increase the SAR. We can also do some alignment, and we do this by magnetic alignment, typically in a gel, agarose gel. We use that and to align it, and we can actually improve the SAR even better in align the particles. Now on this side, let me show you the magnetization of these nanorods. Look at that, 86 EMU per gram, bulk is 92, we're getting there. So indeed, if you are patient, if you use the right techniques, we can make high quality single crystalline nanoparticles which have moments close to the bulk, all right? The other thing is this curve here, magnetization versus temperature. It turns out that magnetite is an oxide that has a very well-known celebrated metal insulator transition at low temperatures. This is called the Vervet transition. And this is well studied over the years, the Verwey transition. It's a first order phase transition, so there is a jump in the magnetization. Here's that. This is the Verwey transition, folks. You will never see it in nanoparticles if it's of low quality. So this can be used as a quality check. If you want to make high quality magnetite, look for the Verwey transition. And if you find it, chances are you've got very high quality single crystalline nanoparticles. So the message is that if you want to increase the SAR, and you have this limitation of this one material that you want to optimize, you need to produce the best quality particles. I am going to finish my talk with just few slides giving some overview of where we are. So right now we are also doing this, cobalt again, but cobalt ferrite is inside and iron oxide is outside shell. And the reason why we use cobalt ferrite is because, as you know, among the ferrites, cobalt ferrite has the highest anisotropy. So we want to use anisotropy as a tool. This is something we want to look at. So these are some results we are getting. We do it in different environments to make sure that we have different conditions. And we cannot, we haven't put it in the, some of them we put it in the cells. Some of them we try to mimic the viscosity of the cells by using the agar. Agar has the same viscosity, it's a starch, same viscosity as the human cell, for example. And we try to mimic the environment of the cells. Here's something else, again through a collaboration with a Spanish group. Now you know why I love Spain, right? And I consider this my second home. This is because I have many collaborations, especially in that part, Asturias and Basque Country. Okay, so this is with the group of Pedro Goria, Jesus Blanco in Oviedo, Montserribas. So what we did here, one of the students came and we tried to do this combining making hybrid nanoparticles. So in this case, we can make these kind of nano clusters by using silver. We can also do it with gold. Gold is even better to use as a seed, metallic seed, and we can grow these clusters of magnetite, making these little nano flowers. Okay? And the idea here is to expose both the surfaces for functionalization. Gold, for example, has its well-known thiol chemistry. You can attach various things to it, and also it's biocompatible. So in principle, you have both the surfaces exposed. It's easy to make core shell. In other words, you have magnetite coated with gold, but then you're losing the surface of the magnetite, right? So in this case, by making these hybrid structures, you're making both the surfaces exposed for functionalization. And functionalization is important because keep in mind that these particles need to be targeted to go to a specific cell. So you need to attach these biomarkers. So you need to have these surfaces ready for functionalization. The other thing is, AC magnetic hyperthermia is not the only way to generate heat. You can actually generate it with metallic particles. In, let's say, 10 nanometer gold particles, you can, if you excite it with a laser at the right frequency, you can excite the surface plasmon resonance, and also you can have dissipation. Okay, so you can generate heat with metallic particles. So in this case, we can actually try two things. We can apply a laser, we can apply AC field. You can also shine a laser combination to give you faster heating. So that's the reason for these hybrid nanoparticles. And yeah, we achieved this. We were able to show that SAR can be increased by combining both these types of heating. Okay. My students started playing with this system. They actually use the AC hypothermia to generate and get to 40 to 45 degrees Celsius, and they turn off the magnet. They use a laser to keep the temperature stable in that regime. So they perfected this way of this dual functionalization. All right, so everything that I told you so far is only half the story. No, I'm not going to give a talk for another hour. Keep in mind that every new particle or material you make, you need to prove or show the biocompatibility. Otherwise, it is not going to go anywhere. It is not going to go to the next stage of trials, clinical trials. So we do this also with biochemists, and it turns out that the cells love to eat the nanoparticles, love to uptake them. And cancer cells are even more hungry. They like to eat a lot more. So we are going to use that to our advantage of feeding the cells our particles. And the way this is done is a very slow process. You have to go to a cell culture lab and culture the cells along with the nanoparticles in a dish, and you can keep looking at it in a microscope for a 24 to 48 hour period. It takes a long time. And that's why we've got graduate students for, right? So they do this, and then what they do is they count under the microscope which cell is moving, which cell is dead. It's called the cell death rate. They monitor that, and that's how you do the cytotoxicity tests. So this needs to be done. And I was giving this talk in SpinTech in Grenoble, and there's this young lady here who did her PhD thesis, and she actually made a video of this process of cells eating the nanoparticles. If I can run this video, it's pretty interesting. It's a fast frame video over 48 hours captured in a few seconds, okay? And you can see how this happens. So the transparent region, these are the cells, glioma cells, and you can see that they're going and grabbing these particles and eating them. Well, when I say eating them, they're keeping them inside, okay? So yeah, I mean, this process works. I mean, they love to eat these nanoparticles, so let's keep feeding them and use that to kill them too. So the process works. We now need the approvals from the FDA and keep this process moving forward to go to the final stage of clinical trials, which is what we are thinking about. And yeah, so we did some studies on how this cytotoxicity is in these particles, and we can show that indeed this technique is effective, and you can target cells, and you can actually kill the cells that you want to kill. All right. I have to also say that there are other methods using magnetic nanoparticles to kill cancer cells, and one of them is through what is called magnetomechanical destruction. I have listed 2 groups here. There are some other groups that work in this. In this case, for example, Russell Cowburn gives talks on this particular method. What they do is that they make these high aspect ratio nanowires or nanorods, but they make it in a way so that they maximize the torque, so that they start spinning around like motors. And in the process, they rupture the cell, they destroy the cell wall, and that's one way of killing cancer cells. There's always a comparison, which technique is better. To me, we need all the techniques we need to destroy cancer. So we have to promote every technique that's available to effectively kill cancer. The advantage these guys have is that they can operate at low fields and low frequencies. So they don't need very high frequencies and fields which are dangerous, considered dangerous for a long time. So this is the advantage they have here. This is also a way of killing cancer. So with this, let me finally, I have to say the good news is that the company MagForce, last year they have come into the United States, and the FDA has given them initial approval to start the process of doing clinical trials in the United States. In fact, as of a few months back, I think it was in October, they have the first, I heard they had the first prostate cancer patient that signed up for this treatment. So we are hoping that this will speed up the process of FDA approval, and we are at a stage where this technology, this technique is going to enter the mainstream medical community very soon. My expectation is 5 to 10 years, because FDA still doesn't move that fast. So we still need a few years for them to finally give the approval to take it to the clinical trial. So with that, let me also say that I'm an associate editor for JAP, and hopefully you've heard of this journal. It's still considered one of the largest journals for the applied physics community research. We publish papers in magnetism a lot. There are 3 of us who are from the magnetism community that are associate editors, myself, Axel Hoffman, and also Paolo Vavasori, who's also in Spain, San Sebastian. So please send your papers to us. We also publish papers in biophysics and other areas related to applied physics. So let me summarize by saying that size does matter. And no, we're not talking about Godzilla, we're talking about nano size. But then nano size has been around for a long time. It's not just the size. It is actually tuning the shapes, surfaces, interfaces. That's what you need to do. You need to go beyond just making nanoparticles. You need to be able to engineer these nanoparticles by playing with the anisotropy, playing with the shapes and sizes. Hopefully this lecture gave you some insights in how something like hypothermia can be improved by using anisotropy as a way to manipulate these particles. So on behalf of, these are some pictures from my lab, on behalf of my group, the Functional Materials Lab at USF, and also the IEEE Magnetic Society, I would like to thank you for your patient attention. I think I took a little bit more time than I thought I would. And like many of you, in our group, the best research discussions come in coffee shops and when we have our Kanye in bars. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Hari, for the nice talk.
because this result is based on patient pain, which is not very scientific.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you know if there is further investigation about the frequencies and the field that a patient can support?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that a new limit? Do you know?
Yeah. There are many people that really don't believe in the Atkinson-Brezovich limit, simply because if you look at the patient's human body, many people can tolerate pain in different ways. So there are some people that have a higher tolerance for pain, some don't. So this is just suggested as an average number. So there is really no strict limit. We can go still higher in frequency and field, but just keep in mind that you have to take the condition of the patient into account when subject to this treatment. So indeed, the frequency and field can be changed depending on the patient's tolerance level. So we need somebody to sign the page saying that, okay, I'll be happy to be subject to torture for 1 hour. So okay, so it depends a little bit on that. But the AB limit, I think it's a very old value, but now they are increasing it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'm down. So my question is, how do you, why the heat is localized only in the cancer cells? So how are you sure that you're not heating up the whole area and giving the cells of the human body?
Yeah. This is the reason I said everything I spoke from a physics and material science perspective for magnetic materials, but we do have several types of functionalization. We can attach specific markers, biomarkers that only target the cancer cells. So this has been done. There will be some collateral damage in the sense that in the area some living cells will also be subject to the heat, but it has been shown that living cells, healthy cells, have a higher tolerance to heat than cancer cells. That's one thing. And the other thing is targeting using biochemical markers. And again, I'm not an expert, but there are ways to target specific cells, cancer cells. And this is why these particles, that's not the only thing. They've got this big hydrodynamic radius where they're carrying all these ligands and the biochemistry part. Okay? I'll go.
I'm not so loud. Okay. So in the pictures you were showing of nanoparticles of different sizes and different shapes, it was the squares and spheres and octopods. I noticed that the aggregation was very different. Could this be the reason that the size increase in the octopods as compared to the spheres?
That's a good question. As I said, many factors could be contributing to the increase. We think that anisotropy is the main reason for this, but the aggregation, we try to avoid that by putting surfactants. So normally we put a biocompatible surfactants. One of the common surfactants that is used is PEG, polyethylene glycol. It's highly biocompatible. In fact, PEG is the polymer that your contact lenses are made of, and you stick it in the eye, right? It's pretty biocompatible. So we use PEG for coating it, and also we use dextran and other things, and these tend to keep the particles away from aggregation. So that's one way of doing it, by having some biocompatible coatings. So the functionalization plays a dual role. It keeps the particles separate, it avoids aggregation, and also has these other functionalities that I mentioned. Again, this is something that needs further investigation as to exactly how changing from DC to AC and looking at the hysteresis loops and what kind of processes are going into the reversal. When we change the particle size and shapes, for example, the reversal process is non-uniform. So we need more insights into the reversal process itself. But in general, from a quantitative point of view, we can see the difference between the different shapes with what we see in terms of hysteresis loops. So, but what I mean by AC hysteresis is that the origin is not the same. In the DC case, you're looking at, these are close to superparamagnetic particles. They may have some small coercivity, but the loop shapes are going to be very different with the AC, and that is because of this high frequency and the fact that these particles are not able to follow the high frequency. So AC loops are different from the DC hysteresis. By the way, you can also use a DC field, and people have done that. In fact, there's a group in Greece, in Thessaloniki, that is trying something new. They're actually using DC fields on top of the AC fields, and this causes the heat to be focused. So this also leads to the previous question. There are ways of focusing it to specific areas even among the cells. You can use a DC field to focus the heating.